Hello everybody, my name is Kat and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things horror. And today I'm excited because I'm doing something a little bit different than what I normally do. Obviously I talk a lot about horror films on this channel, but today I thought I would shift gears a little bit and actually talk about some horror literature I have been reading. I have been wanting to talk about books on this channel for a while, and I did do one video a couple months ago doing a deep dive into Grady Hendrix's book, My Best Friend's Exorcism. That was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to sit down and do another one of those type of video essays. I'm hoping to do one again soon, but in the meantime, I also thought it would be fun to just talk about some of the horror books that I've been reading. A lot of my favorite horror YouTubers will talk about books that they're reading, so I was like, I want to do that too. I am not as knowledgeable in horror literature as I am in horror films. I feel like my knowledge on horror films is pretty vast. And while I love to read, I haven't had that much time to do a lot of reading for fun over the past couple of years. You might know this from some of my other videos, but if you don't, I've spent the last 4 years working on a PhD degree. So I've done a lot of reading, just like a lot of academic journal not fun reading. But now that I'm graduating, I have a lot more time to indulge in fiction. So this first video is going to be a little bit all over the place, just because I have books that I read like last year, last summer, and then books that I've read within just the past couple of months. But I picked out some of my favorites that I've been reading, and yeah, I have a whole stack right here. I have, I think, like 9 books I'm going to be talking about. If you see me looking down here, it's because I'm looking at my notes. So yeah, let's just dive in and get started. Okay, so the first book I am going to talk about is This Thing Between Us. Now, I read this, I want to say last year, early last year. What was that, 2023? Out of all of the books I'm going to be talking about today, this one is definitely one of my favorites. Like, I would definitely put this, it might actually be my favorite out of everything that I'm talking about. This book primarily centers on a young married couple who purchase Alexa-like device, right? Like a Google Home type device. And once they install it, like weird things just start happening in their home and like really terrible things start happening to them. And I promise this is not a spoiler because it says it on the back of the book, but eventually what happens is the wife ends up getting in a horrible accident and dying. And so her husband, Tiago, I think is how you say his name, is basically recalling all of these memories and events in their lives and all of the weird stuff that was happening prior to her death and trying to kind of connect the dots to figure out what was happening. So on the one hand, this book is very much about the horrors of technology, right? You could definitely categorize this as like tech horror and just the way that these technological devices like infiltrate our lives and how they just know every intricacy of our day-to-day. And it's like through this understanding of our patterns, of our behaviors, of our daily rituals, right? Like that's where the technology is able to kind of come in and figure out where your weak points are, right? And play onto your vulnerabilities. However, to say that this is just strictly a technology horror book would be doing it a disservice. It does go a deeper layer than just that. And again, I don't want to spoil any of the books here, but the more you start getting into the story and you start getting into the head of the character, you realize that there's actually something greater happening here than just like an evil Alexa. This is one of the few books that I've read that has genuinely like scared me, like genuinely like creeped under my skin. And it's kind of one of those books where, at least for me, when I was reading it, I didn't really notice it happening. It wasn't until like, you know, those moments when you're home alone and it's getting dark out and there's like weird creaks in the house. It was in like those moments where I felt like a lot of the terror that this book talks about, I could feel it. Like I could feel that kind of uneasiness, that kind of feeling of like someone or something watching me and I'm not realizing it. Also, when I started reading this book, I had just started using a Google Home. And of course, it started doing weird stuff like right as I was reading this book, like just turning on randomly to ask me if I had a question for it, stuff like that. There was one day, this actually happened a couple months ago, like way after I finished reading this book, but there was one day that for some reason my Google Home somehow got connected to a phone call that someone was making. Our Google Home is connected with like the family plan, so I think what was happening is someone within that plan was trying to make a phone call, and for some reason it was coming through through to the Google Home speakers, but I was just like here by myself working, and then I just hear this like voice coming out of the speakers, and it was all like staticky and like weird. It freaked me out so much that I went and ripped the Google Home like out of the wall because I didn't know what was happening. And the first thing my mind went to was this book. So it is very effective storytelling here. Again, while the tech horror is certainly a part of it, this is really a book that's exploring how we as humans just tend to, how we're often prone of getting into these endless cycles of just like negative thinking, right? Of just kind of thinking that things are bad, thinking that, you know, we just have bad luck, or even to go as far as to thinking that we might be cursed, right? Like, it's kind of that thing where, like, no, there's something externally that's being put upon us that's making life so difficult. It really is just us kind of being stuck in these really negative, repetitive thought patterns. And those thought patterns then, like, reflecting in our real world everyday life. And that's where this book is really more interested in it. Like, the technology is really just like a vehicle in which these negative thoughts can start manifesting. It also looks a lot at things like trauma and grief and guilt. I will say the ending of this book is a little esoteric. It's a bit wild. It very much, again, I don't want to give like too much away, but like if I would have to describe a film that the ending reminds me of, it would be something like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Just be aware of that. But I highly recommend this book. I really love this book. It's one I keep going back to. It's one I'm still thinking about a year plus later. Also, the author that wrote it, Gus Marino, I think is how you say his name. He is Latin American, so there's also a lot of really interesting Latin American culture that he's bringing into this book, and some folklore as well, so that also gives a really interesting perspective to the events that are happening here. This Thing Between Us, I give it 5 stars, 10 out of 10. Keeping within the tech horror subgenre, the next book I have is Where They Wait. This is another one that I read last summer, I believe, or you know, it might actually have been like 2 summers ago at this point. So this book follows a protagonist named Nick, who after being laid off from his newspaper job is going back home in New England, and he's living in his family's cabin for a while. And while he is there, he stumbles upon this new like tech wellness company that has sprung up. Basically, you have this like tech bro who is developing this new kind of meditation sleep aid app, right? It's one of those apps where like you put your headphones in and you listen to the music or you listen to the stories that's telling you. There's meditation exercises with it, and it's all supposed to help you calm your anxiety. And of course, because this is a horror book, there is something nefarious going on with the app and with its creator. And yes, basically what you learn is happening is that the creator is obsessed with the folklore around like the siren. When you think of like sirens or mermaids as they're often called, and the whole idea of the siren song, right, that they have these songs that they sing, and these are songs that they would use to lure fishermen into their evil clutches. They're very much one of these kind of classic monstrous feminine figures in that respect. So the evil tech bro in this book is basically hunting down these ancient siren songs, and these are the songs that are being played in the app. Basically the idea of using the siren song as a form of mind control. So Nick, being a journalist, stumbles onto all of this, and the book is really about him trying to figure out the mystery behind this app. He does listen to the songs himself, and then he starts hallucinating, so you have a lot of that psychological horror happening as well. I really liked the way that this book combined like ancient folklore with new technology. I thought that was very clever, and I was really interested in that dynamic. And I kind of wish this book had gone a little bit deeper with that. I don't know if you can hear it, but my Google Home just started talking. It's just giving me a reminder. I don't know what it is. Every time I talk about This Thing Between Us, my Google Home just likes to go rogue. It just likes to start chatting at me. Anyway, back to Where They Wait. Again, I wish it had gone a little bit deeper, and not just in the themes I was exploring, but also within the characters as well. Like, my thing with this book is I didn't hate it, but I didn't really love it either. It didn't really draw me in. I would probably give it like 3 stars. And when I try to think of like what it is about this book that I didn't like, it's not so much the writing as it is just the story felt a little surface level for me. The characters were a little like two-dimensional. Like, they're kind of characters that we've seen in other books before, right? Where you have a protagonist that has PTSD from being a news reporter in the war. So you have that. He's coming from a troubled family. He doesn't have a great relationship with his mom or his dad. There's like girlfriend issues, of course, because there always is. Then you have kind of like evil tech bro. That's just kind of like your standard evil tech bro. There's also a love interest that pops up in here. She is working for evil tech bro, but then goes on the side of the journalist. But again, she's just kind of there to be like love interest. I don't know. I just wish like the characters were a bit more rich and the story was a bit richer. This is written by Scott Carson, who I believe is a pseudonym for another author. I might be wrong about that, but I feel like that's what I remember reading. I don't know who Scott is a pseudonym for. What I will say is that a lot of the writing, a lot of what was in here was kind of giving me like Stephen King vibes. I don't think this was written by Stephen King, but I feel like it's written by someone that has like those Stephen King vibes. I mean, I'm pretty sure this book also takes place in Maine, so that might have also been why I was getting like Stephen King in reading this. But I didn't feel like the setting in this book came alive in the same way that Maine does when you're reading a Stephen King novel. And to be fair, Stephen King will go for pages and pages and pages and pages just describing like a swing set in a small town. So we don't need that level of detail always, but again, everything here just kind of felt like Stephen King light to me. Like diet Stephen King. That's kind of what this book felt like. I wish it had embraced its more fantastical elements a little bit more. You do have stuff with like the protagonist hallucinating, especially after he hears the siren song. But again, I just feel like that could have been a little bit more like vivid, or there could have been more things to explore within those hallucinations. But again, really cool concept with the whole app idea. So I think this would be a suitable summer read. I think this would be like a suitable beach read. There's probably people out there that would enjoy this more than I would. So I would say give it a shot, especially if it's like, you know, at your local library and you can borrow it. So my next book is World War Z. I know that this book has been out for quite a number of years now. I did not read it until last summer. We read this in the book club that I'm a part of. My reasoning for not reading this sooner, I honestly was avoiding it for a really long time. And part of that, for me, I feel like zombies, they're kind of similar to vampires in the respect that we've just had an oversaturation of them in our pop culture. So as far as horror goes, they're just monsters that I'm kind of burnt out on. I feel the exact same way about vampires. And zombies are usually not like my favorite. Obviously, you know, love Romero. But outside of those films, like, I don't know, I'm just not that like interested in them. So there was that aspect to it. Also, the film adaptation that came out, the one with Brad Pitt, I mean, that looked so bad. To this day, I still haven't seen it. I just remember people saying how bad it was. And so that just like completely turned me off from the whole like World War Z franchise universe. So it was my first time reading it last summer, and I will actually say I was pleasantly surprised by this book. It is very much not what the movie is. I'm guessing, again, I haven't seen the movie, but from what I've been told by my friends, the movie is very different from the book. The book is basically a series of interviews. Our unnamed interviewee is basically going around and just talking to different people about their experiences and their stories of how they experienced this zombie outbreak and what they had to do to survive, essentially. And so I really thought that was an interesting way to tell the story. You don't see that a lot in books, and for good reason. I feel like there are certain stories that definitely lend to that format, and this was one of them. And I really just enjoyed seeing like the different perspectives throughout the book and the different cultures that were represented. Like, I think one thing that really impressed me about Max Brooks' writing here is the way that he's able to craft all of these different kinds of characters from various backgrounds, from various cultures, various generations as well. How he's able to create all of these characters and give each of them a very distinct voice. Like, I could imagine as a writer to take on a project like this, one of my biggest fears would be, you know, that I'm making all the interviews sound the same, right? That all of the characters kind of have the same voice. And he does a really good job of just giving everyone their own distinct backgrounds and personalities. I would really love to know what his process was when he was writing this book. And I mean, some of the stories in here are like really chilling. One of the stories that got me, if you've read the book, you'll know, it's the story with the family that ends up getting in an RV and finding like this little community out in the forest of like fellow campers, and they're basically trying to recreate society. They're basically trying to create a little like civilization of their own. And things start really great at first, and then as their resources slowly start to dwindle, things just turn into chaos. Like, I found that particular story very chilling, and I think the reason why is because so much of this book isn't like focused on the actual horror of the zombies. I mean, that's definitely there, but a lot of it is also focusing just on like human nature and how when that survival instinct kicks in of like fight, flight, freeze, what we as humans will do to each other, to ourselves, in order to survive. This book was particularly chilling coming off of like the pandemic, because there's so much in here, especially around the ways that, you know, sometimes our media and government, in an attempt to try to keep us safe and in an attempt to try to keep everyone sane even when there is a disaster occurring, will sometimes like push things under the rug or just try to act like things are not as bad as they seem. And then that just kind of leads to its own consequences as well. There's also a lot of things in here about the media and how the media just like plays on our fear, especially like the 24-hour news cycle, and how it always wants us in a state of fear or anxiety because that's how it gets ratings. I thought the way that the media was portrayed in this book was really fascinating. And the way that it was used not just to spread information, but also how it's used for like propaganda, like how film in particular is used as a medium of getting people re-engaged and giving them a purpose to go out there and like fight the zombies. Like, they're using media propaganda as a way of getting people to become soldiers to go out and fight off these zombies. And so I thought a lot of that was really interesting as well. And again, based off of real life tactics that have been used in like actual wars. So I really enjoyed this book. I think it's a really interesting exploration of just humanity as a whole. Up next, I have Wolf Winter. This was written by Cecilia Ekbach, I think is how you say her name. So this is very much a like historical horror book. It's set in Sweden in 1717, and it follows this family who are migrating from Finland to Sweden, basically building a new home within this very rural community. And once they move into their new home, weird things start happening within the environment around them. And it starts with one of the daughters of the Finnish family going out into the woods and finding a dead body. And it's a body that's been mauled and mutilated. And so then the question becomes like, who killed this guy? Was it someone within this community? There's also a lot around like folklore and a little bit of witchcraft in here. So there's also concerns that, you know, it might be a nefarious supernatural creature of some kind, that it might be like one of these evil wolves that they talk about in their folklore that is now haunting this community. So it's very much a folk horror in that respect. I love folk horror, and so I had a really good time reading this book. I read this over Christmas. It was my Christmas reading. I think one thing that the author does really well here is giving very detailed descriptions. Like, it's one of those books that very much like brings you into the world, into the atmosphere that it's creating. I also really like it because my family on my mother's side is from Finland. And I believe the author, yeah, her family is Finnish as well. There's a lot of like historical stuff that she's bringing into this book. So as someone whose ancestry comes from that land, I really enjoyed learning about the history of it and a lot of the everyday customs of people during this time period. Like, I kind of felt like I was getting to learn about my ancestors a little bit reading this book. So I would say if you're into like folk horror or just more like historical horror, this is definitely one to check out. I will also say too, very similar to World War Z, while there is a lot of like fantastical stuff happening here in terms of, again, like these wolves that will come to the door and like what's going on with them, or these like themes of paganism. While that's definitely an element in this book, it is not like the main focus. A lot of the actual horror is coming more from the human characters, how the human characters are treating each other. This is definitely a story in which you have a community that is trying to like figure out who is doing these murders. And in like any community, you know, they have their alliances, they have the politics, they have the people that they don't get along with or that they like find suspicious, right? There's a lot of old grievances that come up. And because this is a book that is following a new family, often the new people to come to a community are going to be some of the first people that are suspected when something weird starts happening. So it's also a book about how the family, particularly the mom, is trying to work through these dynamics, right? Just trying to work with these people within the community that do have these violent tendencies and are really concerned with just their own survival and the survival of their families. So you definitely get a lot of the human aspect aspects in here, and again, just kind of the awful ways that human beings can treat one another. The weather in this book as well also plays a very pivotal role. The majority of the book takes place during the winter months, and my understanding is that a wolf winter, that means a winter that is very cold, a lot of heavy snow, a lot of ice. These families are having to deal with very erratic weather on top of everything else, right? So in certain parts of this book, it just becomes about this family's fight for survival. Again, most of this book deals with the mother of the family as well as her two daughters. Her husband is absent for a lot of it because he like goes away on, I think it's like a fishing trip. He basically has to go out and find work to get money and resources to bring back to the family. So the mom is just kind of stuck at home taking care of everything. And that means having to figure out how she and her family can survive this winter, right? How can they stay warm without getting like hypothermia? Their animals are like dying because of the cold. Their food supply is running low. Like it very much becomes a story of survival within like the middle part. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Again, if you're someone that is really interested in like the more historical, real life horrors of the everyday, I think you'll really enjoy this book. If you're someone that wants a book with more emphasis on like the folklore or the supernatural or the witchcraft, you're not going to get much of that in here. Most of that is really saved for like the characters' inner thoughts, like their own kind of beliefs about the world and their own understandings of like the seasons and kind of what's happening. But again, I really enjoyed this book. I had a good time reading it over the winter season. It's one that I would definitely say wait and read during winter time because it just has like those vibes. I also really liked the way that this book switches between perspectives. You get the mother's perspective, but you also get the older daughter's perspective as well. So you get to kind of see these like two generations of women and how they're just dealing with, again, just the everyday stuff that they have to go through. So yeah, I would highly recommend Wolf Winter. I'd probably give it like 4 out of 5. Okay, quick coffee break. So the next book that I have is The Final Girl Support Group. This is written by Grady Hendrix, who is very much becoming one of my favorite authors. This book is very much a love letter to the horror genre. This is a book that imagines a world in which the final girls of all of our favorite slasher films, like the Halloweens, Nightmare on Elm Street, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, what would happen if those characters were actually based off of real life women who went through these horrible circumstances, had to fight off these serial killers, then basically get together like every month or so in this group setting just to talk about their trauma and what they kind of went through. And then at the beginning of the book, it is revealed that there is a killer on the loose who is targeting the final girls again. And then the protagonist, Lynette, has to figure out what is going on. She has to rally the rest of the final girls together so that they can stop this monster once and for all. I think what Grady Hendrix does so well is taking these like horror tropes that we're all very familiar with and just like turning them on their head, just making them like really funny. But there are also stories that are very deep in themes of like friendship and love between friends. You get that in here as well. And he just writes really great characters. Like Grady Hendrix writes some of the best women characters that I've read. I will say I didn't quite love this book as much as I loved My Best Friend's Exorcism. And I think that's just because My Best Friend's Exorcism, like it's so centered on the relationship between these two girls, and you really get to dive deep into like their history and their friendship. Whereas here we kind of have multiple characters going on, and we have Lynette who's just kind of bouncing around from different places trying to solve this mystery. And I feel like some of the final girls weren't as fleshed out as others. But overall, I really enjoyed this book a lot. I would give it 5 stars. What I also like about this book too is that Grady Hendrix, every chapter, will put like, you know, things like fake police reports. I don't know if you can like see that. There's also like fake movie reviews in here as well, or like fake like journal articles, like people writing think pieces on these type of movies. Like, you know, you got something like this, which is like I think like a VHS like advertisement or something. So you just have a lot of that kind of fun stuff throughout the book as well, that adds stuff to the universe that he's creating without the characters needing to like spell it out for you, which I really appreciate. So the final girls in this book are, again, very much based off of the final girls that we all know, like Laurie from Halloween, Halloween or Nancy. But while they're definitely based on those characters, they're not like a complete copy of those characters. They do have things about them that set them apart from the final girls that we're used to seeing in the films. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Like, don't go into this book thinking that it's going to be a story about like the Lori and Nancy that we know from the movies. They are very different characters in that respect, which I did appreciate that Hendrix did take his own kind of creative liberties and really kind of fleshed out these characters to imagine like what they would be like if they were real life women who went through some of these horrific events. And I think that also puts like an interesting spin on this book too, and the fact that because these women are treated as like actual real people who had this real trauma put upon them, and then that trauma was sold to like movie studios to make all of these endless franchises out of it. Like, there is an element of true crime I feel like that this book is making commentary on as well, and kind of our culture's obsession with like these serial killers that we have in pop culture, whether they be like real, like the Ted Bundys, who I'm going to talk about more in a minute, or the fake ones like the Michael Myers and the Jason Voorhees, and how so much of these stories is centered around like these killers, and the victims are just like there as, you know, a vehicle to get the story told, or more of an afterthought. So there is that commentary that's happening with this book as well, asking, you know, like, why do we as a culture, why do we get so obsessed with this kind of violence? Why do we use it as entertainment? And again, he's not like doing this as a way of, you know, like criticizing these films. Again, this is very much a love letter to slasher movies, but I think it's more of just an interesting inquiry that he's bringing up, right? Again, of this kind of obsession that we have with things like true crime, which actually brings me to the next book that I'm going to talk about. But I'll just say Final Girl Support Group, 5 out of 5. Highly recommend you check it out. Okay, so while we're on the topic of true crime, that does lead me to the next book, which I just finished reading like a couple weeks ago, Bright Young Woman. This was another one that my book club read, and it is very much a true crime book. I did not know that going into it, but it's basically a fictionalized version of what some of the victims of Ted Bundy, I believe, what some of his victims went through. And so this book very much deals with the perspective of these three women, and it takes place at different time periods as well. So you have one that takes place in, I think, the late 1970s, and then one that takes place a couple of years earlier. And again, these are all women who unfortunately had to cross paths with Ted Bundy and just the aftermath of that. And it's very much a book about, you know, these women who are, yes, seeking justice, but also trying to figure out, like, just because this bad thing happened to me, I don't want that defining my life. But in so many ways that does end up defining like who these women are and who they become later on in life. I have to say this was not my favorite. I'll also say here right now, like, as much as I love horror, I am not a true crime fan. I don't watch a lot of true crime. I don't listen to the podcast. It's honestly not my favorite thing, and I always have people question me because they're like, you love horror, how can you not love true crime? And I feel like there is this misconception that just because you love horror, you must also enjoy true crime. And maybe for the majority of horror fans that is true, but I will just say for me personally, like, I'm not a true crime fan. I much more prefer the fantastical elements in horror. I'm not trying to come at people that love true crime. I get it. I see the appeal of it. And it might also be a bit hypocritical of me to say, because it's like, well, you enjoy slasher films. And yes, I do, but I feel like even within like the slasher genre of like the Michael Myers, the Jason Voorhees, the Freddy Kruegers. Again, you have a lot of the supernatural elements that are coming in here, right? If you think of something like Michael Myers, and how within like the first film, he's just kind of described as like the shape, right? Just this like shadowy figure, just this embodiment of evil. So I feel like for me, there's like a little bit of distance between the real life because there are oftentimes some sort of supernatural element associated with these characters. I don't know, that might be a cop-out, but I just prefer watching like fictionalized horror versus the real life horror. And so with this book, once I found out that it was really just a fictionalized retelling of something that was real, I became like even less interested in it. Even before I knew that, when I was reading the book, I just found a lot of it to be very meandering. I really appreciated the first part of the book, like when some of the more, I guess, like slasher film elements are happening. Admittedly, when my friend told me that we were reading this for book club, she kind of described it as like a slasher film, just like in book form. So I was going into this book thinking it was going to be like Halloween, and it's very much not that. So I enjoyed the first part of it, and then again just found a lot of the middle part to be very just kind of slow. And yes, you're getting to learn about like the characters, but the problem that I had is that the main characters in this book, I just found them to be so annoying. And I feel bad saying that because I know they're supposed to be based off of real life people, but there's just something about the way that the author wrote these characters where they just feel very one-dimensional. Like they feel caricatures of real life people. You've got like one girl who is like the sorority sister and she's very, you know, like type A. Then she meets up with like this other woman who has connections to one of the killer's victims from the past. And she's this very eccentric character that, you know, dresses in all these kind of like crazy costumes. And she's like rich, like she married like an old guy and then got a bunch of money from him when he died. Like it's all that, but that's like their whole like personalities. That's as far as the characters go. And so yeah, they just felt very like two-dimensional and just felt very annoying to read. Because again, they didn't really feel like real people. And I know a lot of people in my book club weren't big fans of it either, and we actually had a couple of people who DNF'd the book about like 60 pages in. I would probably give this one like 2.5 stars. That being said, I know that this has gotten a lot of praise online. So I would say if you are someone that's interested in true crime, especially stuff related around like Ted Bundy, give it a shot because you might like it much more than I did. The next book that I have 2 left. The next one that I have is The Shards by Bret Easton Ellis. Okay, so this was another book club pick, and I will tell you right now that pretty much everybody in my book club hated this story. I didn't hate it. I didn't love it either. There are definitely parts of this book where I was reading it and I was just like, Jesus, Bret, shut up. This is very much I guess you would call it an auto-fictional story in the sense that Bret Easton Ellis is the main protagonist. It is a story that takes place when he was a teenager, and it's basically him talking about the events that happened in his life that led him to write his first book, Less Than Zero. More specifically, how these events are very much connected to these awful killings that were happening in the Los Angeles area during his final year as a high school student. And I will say, the biggest detractor of this book is that it is very self-absorbed. It's a lot of like navel gazing, and again, I call it like a fictional biography because while Bret Easton Ellis is definitely making himself the main character, and while there are certainly aspects about his real life that are in here, there are also other aspects that are very much exaggerated for the purpose of telling the story. And the way that he's describing himself and his life and his friends in this book is this very like grandiose version of their lives, right? They're all these like super rich kids that live in like Malibu and Beverly Hills. And they have all these like fancy cars they just like drive around in and listen to all of this like cool 80s like synth music. And they like spend their weekends going to the Grove and watching like art house films. And they're doing like cocaine and having sex and, you know, all of this stuff. It's very much kind of a caricature and very much poking fun at this cultural imagination of like this time period, right? Like how we think of like Los Angeles in the 1980s and how it was often portrayed in film and TV. This is very much like Beverly Hills 90210 meets American Psycho. So if that's something that seems appealing to you, you might enjoy this. But again, a lot of this book, it really is Bret Easton Ellis just kind of like blowing smoke up his own ass. And there are parts of this book that like he'll just repeat himself like multiple times. Like he'll describe someone in very similar language throughout different points of the book. And so there are times when I was reading this and I was like reading how he was describing someone, and it was just like, yes, Bret, I know you just talked about that in the last chapter. Why are you telling me this again? Those parts of the book are definitely annoying. If you're a fan of Bret Easton Ellis, you'll probably enjoy this more. If you're not a fan of his work, or if you're someone and you've never read his previous books like Less Than Zero or American Psycho, I would say check those out first. I would not say to make this your first Bret Easton Ellis book. I feel like this is also very much like him having a dialogue with his like previous work, right? Like this is almost like a version of his life in which his characters are real people that he really interacted with. It kind of reminds me of something like, you know, something like Wes Craven's New Nightmare, right? Where you have this idea of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise that has just gotten like so big to the point where the horror of the franchise actually starts manifesting within the very real lives of like the actors, the director. Now, This book isn't that exactly. That's probably a bad example to use because I don't want to make it seem like, you know, this is a book where Bret Easton Ellis is just like walking around and then he runs into like Patrick Bateman. Right, it's not a story like that, but there are definitely characters that you can tell are like supposed to be stand-ins for like Patrick Bateman or stand-ins for some of his other characters in his books. They even use some of the same dialogue as well. So I guess that's what I mean when I'm saying like it definitely feels like him having a dialogue with his previous work and kind of reflecting on how like the work that he's done, how that impacts how he sees himself as the creator. Like I feel like a lot of this book is him just kind of like responding to how critics or audiences have seen him as a person, how they create assumptions about him based off of the things that he writes. And so he's kind of like taking these assumptions about him and creating this very grandiose version of himself within this book. So this isn't really like Bret Easton Ellis story. It's like Bret Easton Ellis as imagined by the critics and the audience and pop culture. That version of Bret Easton Ellis, that's what his story is in here. I hope that makes sense. I don't know. I would probably give this, I don't know, 3 stars. That might be too generous. So my final book that I'm going to talk about today is Bunny by Mona Awad. Full disclosure here, I actually haven't finished reading this book yet. I think I have like 20 pages or so. I have like this many pages left. So I'm very close to finishing it, and I tried to finish it before I made this video, but unfortunately this is like the only time that I had to sit down and make this, so I was like, okay, well, I'll just give like my thoughts on what I think of this book so far. I started reading this because it is very popular within like book YouTubers talking about it. I know it's very popular on TikTok as well, and I will say so far out of the 270 pages that I've read, I love this book. I love this book a lot. I would probably put this right at the top. It's very much up there with This Thing Between Us as far as like my favorite books go that I've read recently. And it's hard to talk about this book without getting into spoilers, and I don't want to spoil it because I would say like just go in blind and read it. But essentially what you have is this protagonist Samantha. She goes to this very prestigious MFA writing program at this very prestigious college in New England. And within her program, within her cohort, are these 4 other women. These women are like very beautiful, they're very well put together. When I read them, I imagine them as like the plastics from Mean Girls. Like that's what I think of. And within the book, this group of girls refers to themselves as the bunnies. Like they will actually refer to each other as bunnies. And so one day they invite Samantha to kind of come into their clique, and she learns what they're about and very much falls into a literal rabbit hole with these women and sees what's actually really going on with them. I think what I love most about this book is that it is very much a satire on like liberal arts education and like creative writing or just any kinds of artsy MFA programs. And listen, as someone that did an MFA program in screenwriting, as someone that is a part of academia and just a part of that world, I very much appreciated a lot of the humor about that, and often a lot of the humor around the, you know, pretentiousness of a lot of these institutions and a lot of these programs, right? This idea of like, you know, sacrificing yourself for the art and how you have to open yourself up and open up the wounds to like create something beautiful, right? It's all this kind of jargon that you often hear in these kind of programs. So I appreciated that. I would say if you're someone that's kind of within this world, you would probably really like this book. This is very much mixing like horror with dark humor. In many ways, it reminds me of Heathers. And it was funny because there's like one character that gets introduced in this book, and as I was reading him, I kept picturing Christian Slater in my head. I was like, this is such a Christian Slater in Heathers. And then literally a few pages later, the description of this character describes him as Christian Slater in Heathers. And I was like, yes, I knew it. I also really love how, again, I don't want to like spoil anything here, but this is also a book that talks a lot about, you know, girlhood and kind of like the typical like standard things that like young women are expected to enjoy. There's a lot of like, you know, unicorns and sparkles. The bunnies in this book, like they're very much all about like light and love and like eating like cupcakes and thinking about kittens and kind of like all those stereotypes around girlhood. But what I love about this book is that I think on the one hand, it's very much a celebration of those things, and it's very much, you know, allowing its characters to indulge in these things and find a lot of pleasure in them, while also acknowledging some of the darker aspects of that and how so much of that can be caught up in, like, you know, societal expectations of what young women should be enjoying or how they should be spending their time, kind of forcing yourself into liking something that maybe you don't really enjoy, or if you do enjoy it, then maybe you feel bad about enjoying it because it's things that like other people make fun of. So it has an interesting balance in which it is both celebrating like extreme girlhood and femininity, but also recognizing some of the darker aspects of that as well. This is not a book that is like preaching at you or anything. This is just something that I picked up on while reading it, and this is definitely a book that I would love to go back into and just kind of explore these elements of femininity that it is bringing up. So yeah, I'm not sure about the ending. I might get to the ending and it might completely like fall apart, and the reveal of what the horror is in this world, I love it. It is both gruesome and hilarious at the same time. So I would highly recommend checking out Bunny. For me, it was at least worth all of the hype. So those are all the books that I've been reading the past like 2 years. As far as books coming up for this summer, I have a couple that I know I want to read. I have this book right here that I've seen people talk about online a lot, Tender is the Flesh. So this is probably the next one I will read after I finish Bunny. I also have Horror Store, another Grady Hendrix book that I will probably be diving into this season as well. If you have any recommendations for really good horror books that you've checked out in the past couple of months, please let me know in the comments down below. Let me know what you plan on reading this summer. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I talked about here and what your thoughts on them were. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.